Welcome everyone. We're back for another video. This is the first reflection video in the multi-part assignment. This one's about the Okada and the Parchmann studies. So let's talk about them. I am here in lovely Baltimore, Maryland at my sister-in-law's house in her very green office. Everything in here is green. It's kind of spooky. So let's talk a little bit about these two papers. So the both papers were essentially about how Stuart McGill's spinal hygiene work and the FMS functional movement screen pertain to and predict for athletic performance. This is a very interesting one because I worked at Equinox for several years, and on every client intake that you do, you perform the FMS for them and use it as a way to talk about how you're going to build out their program and all that stuff. Now, I always had my doubts because when I started at Equinox, I was just coming out of college track and field. I knew that I was a good mover, I was mobile, I was strong, I was fast, but these very specific tests in the FMS really stymied me. I remember particularly having problems with the inline lunge assessment, the overhead squat assessment. The rest of them, I think, went pretty well for me. But I remember thinking, like, how could it be possible that I, as someone who am very athletic, am failing at these tests? If these are a predictor of my athletic potential, then clearly something is amiss here. What was amiss was my thinking in assuming that they were good predictors of athletic performance. Now, these papers both kind of explore how these methodologies relate to each other and how they relate to collective athletic performance results. So looking at each of the tests within the FMS and each of Stuart McGill's core endurance tests that he uses to predict lower back pain, and trying to correlate them positively or negatively to athletic performance. The big takeaways, and this is something I kind of had my suspicions about, the big takeaways is that neither are really good for predicting athletic performance, and there's a lot of reasons for that. At base level, and I think this was listed in the Okada paper, the FMS is too specific. It is too task-specific to be a general overall predictor of athletic performance. There are certain movement patterns that it definitely assesses very well, but when you talk about something like athletic performance that is so vague and often so broad, metrics like this that are very specific to themselves are very hard to use as predictors of other pieces of the athletic puzzle. Both of them are pretty niche diagnostic tools. The Stuart McGill tests are used specifically as a predictor and kind of, test for lower back pain, which, does it correlate with performance? Maybe, but it definitely is not, hand in hand. And the FMS, same deal. These are very specific tasks that assess kind of very specific joint mobility and can assess a lot of movement qualities, but ultimately are not good predictors for performance because of how specific they are. And again, when I was working at Equinox, I had this kind of, back and forth in my head because I had all these clients that were really, really strong and very athletic, but had done poorly on the FMS. Conversely, I noticed that the people I had that did really well on the FMS typically started at a much lower entry point in training. There's a lot of reasons for that. We'll loop back to that at the end, actually. Now, I think the FMS is too catered to, again, injured and dysfunctional individuals to be a good predictor for athletic performance. These tests are so rigorous. I'm really thinking about the inline lunge test most of all. These tests are so rigorous and so specific that they are hard to use as broad or general predictors of anything, let alone performance, which is not really something that is related to either of these two protocols. Now, again, the reason for all this is that both of these have purposes and origins that are outside of athletic performance. In terms of, structure and anatomy and physiology, both of these tests are valid as ways to screen for movement and look for dysfunction. The problem is dysfunction sometimes works in athletics. So, good example, if you have someone that can't nail that inline lunge because they don't necessarily have the balance for it, there's something causing that. For me, my quads and my hips are so big that I have trouble standing in a straight line for the lunge assessment. Um, does that mean I'm worse at sports than my counterparts that are better at the inline lunge assessment? Absolutely not. I would argue that I am faster by a large margin than most people who would score better than me on the FMS. But again, the FMS isn't meant to test for athletic performance. So the last question here was, where did you start and where did you end up? Well, I started knowing a good deal about the FMS because I had used it practically at work for so many years. And I knew a lot about Stuart McGill generally because as someone who has been in exercise science for a while, he's a name that people talk about. If you've been a personal trainer for any length of time, you certainly have had clients that have low back pain, and that means that you should be at least a little bit familiar with Stuart McGill's work. So I knew a little bit of it. But I think that from survey 1 to survey 2, reading the articles in the middle, the biggest thing I learned, the big takeaway for me is that all of these tests and these protocols and these modalities, any methodology really that we use in fitness has a time and a place. There are certainly times and places where both the McGill tests and the FMS are perfect and do exactly what they're supposed to do and give us exactly the numbers that they're supposed to do. Athletic performance just isn't one of them because the demands of athletics for most sports are just so far outside of what the McGill test or the FMS are even testing for. So this was reflection number 1. If I had to pick a paper, I think the Okada paper was my favorite. Yeah, I hope to hear what you guys have to say. Reflection number 1, in and done. We'll see you in the next one. I can't believe that just rhymed. That was so good.